Do you believe that consciousness can exist outside the body? What if we told you right now that there are documented medical cases that suggest exactly that? And if you think that near-death experiences are just hallucinations, just the random firings of a dying brain, then we're really curious to hear how you explain these 10 verified cases that left doctors, nurses, and researchers completely stunned. So let's dive straight into the first case. And this one is the story that started it all. The case so famous in near-death research that it's been debated for nearly 50 years. Number 10. The tennis shoe on the hospital ledge. In 1977, a migrant worker named Maria was visiting friends in Seattle when she suffered a massive heart attack. She was rushed to Harborview Medical Center and placed in the coronary care unit. A few days later, while recovering, her heart suddenly stopped. Medical staff rushed in and successfully resuscitated her. Standard medical emergency. Nothing unusual so far. But what happened next would change everything for a young social worker named Kimberly Clark Sharp. Sharp was assigned to help Maria process the trauma of her cardiac arrest. But when she went to speak with her patient, Maria was extremely agitated. She had something urgent to tell someone, something she knew would sound absolutely crazy. Maria pointed to a corner of the ceiling and said she had been up there, floating, watching everything unfold below her. Now, Sharp had heard this kind of thing before. Patients who'd been through cardiac arrest sometimes reported strange experiences. She assumed Maria was describing a dream or a hallucination from the medication. But Maria wasn't finished. She described in precise detail who had been in the room during her resuscitation, where they were standing, what they were doing, what they were saying. She described the placement of machinery and all the paper that had been kicked around on the floor during the resuscitation, paper that the electrocardiogram machine had been continuously feeding out. Sharp was intrigued, but still skeptical. Maria could have overheard conversations later. She could have made lucky guesses. There had to be a rational explanation. And then Maria told her about the shoe. With a snap of her fingers to show how fast she had moved, Maria said she suddenly found herself outside the hospital room, looking down at the emergency room entrance. She described the curvature of the driveway, the vehicles going in one direction, the doors opening automatically. Everything absolutely accurate. But then something had distracted her. She found herself looking at a window ledge on the north side of the 3rd floor. And there, sitting on that ledge, was a single tennis shoe. A man's dark blue tennis shoe, well worn, scuffed on the left side where the little toe would go. And here's the detail that made Sharp freeze. The shoelace was caught under the heel. Maria desperately wanted someone to find that shoe, not to prove to herself that it was real. She knew she was telling the truth. She needed to prove it to others, to show that she had really been outside her body, floating above the hospital. Kimberly Clark Sharp was a trained social worker, a rational professional. But something in Maria's conviction made her decide to look. She went to the 3rd floor. She searched window by window. She had to press her face directly against the glass and look down just to see the ledge properly. And there it was, a dark blue tennis shoe, well worn, with a scuff on the side where the little toe would go, and a shoelace tucked under the heel. Sharp later wrote about that moment. She said the only way Maria could have had such a perspective was if she had been floating right outside and at very close range to the tennis shoe, the little toe scuff, the shoelace under the heel. These were details you could only see from directly outside the window, not from inside a hospital room, and certainly not while lying unconscious during a cardiac arrest. Sharp retrieved the shoe and brought it back to Maria. She says it sat in the hospital for 3 weeks, like a relic. Visitors came to see it. The shoe heard round the world, as it would later be called. But here's what makes this case so compelling to researchers. The shoe was not visible from any normal vantage point inside the hospital. Maria had never been to that floor. She had been brought in through the emergency room and taken directly to the coronary care unit. And during the time she described seeing the shoe, her heart had stopped beating and her brain was not receiving oxygen. Sharp would later become one of the founding members of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. She followed Maria as an outpatient for 3 years before losing contact with her. The shoe, she says, is still somewhere in her garage. Skeptics have tried to debunk this case for decades. Maybe Maria glimpsed the shoe earlier without remembering. Maybe Sharp's memory isn't reliable. Maybe the whole thing was exaggerated over time. But no one has ever adequately explained how a cardiac arrest patient described an object on a ledge she couldn't have seen, in a location she'd never visited, with details that required floating directly outside a 3rd-floor window. And that was just the beginning. What you're about to hear next involves a woman who was not just clinically dead, but had all the blood drained from her brain during surgery. Number 9. The woman who died on the operating table and watched everything. If the Maria case was the story that started the conversation, then Pam Reynolds is the case that refuses to go away. In August 1991, Pam Reynolds Lowry was wheeled into the operating room at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. She was 35 years old, a singer and songwriter from Atlanta, and she was about to undergo one of the most extreme surgical procedures in modern medicine. Reynolds had an aneurysm, a giant one, sitting right at the base of her brain, on the brainstem itself. It was already leaking. Any day, it could rupture and kill her instantly. Her doctors in Atlanta told her the situation was hopeless. No surgeon would attempt to operate on an aneurysm in that location. But there was one man who might try. Dr. Robert Spetzler, a neurosurgeon at Barrow who had pioneered a procedure called hypothermic cardiac arrest, or as the surgeons called it, the standstill operation. The procedure was extreme. They would lower Reynolds' body temperature to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, stop her heart, drain all the blood from her brain. Then, with her brain completely empty and still, they would cut out the aneurysm. If everything went perfectly, they would rewarm her body, restart her heart, and hope she woke up the same person. This was not a routine surgery. This was controlled death. Reynolds was prepared meticulously. Both ear canals were fitted with small molded speakers that would emit loud clicking sounds many times per second to monitor her brainstem function. Her eyes were taped completely shut. Her head was secured in a specialized vise covered with surgical drapes. Electrodes were placed to monitor her brainwaves. At 10:50 in the morning, they began cooling her body. As her temperature dropped toward 60 degrees, her heart stopped. Her EEG went completely flat. No brainwave activity whatsoever. They tilted the operating table, turned off the cardiopulmonary bypass machine, and drained the blood from her head. By every medical definition, Pam Reynolds was dead. And yet, Reynolds would later describe hearing a sound like a natural D note that seemed to pull her out of her body. She said she floated above the operating table and watched the doctors work on her. She described the surgical saw they used to open her skull. But here's the thing. She said it looked like an electric toothbrush with a dent in it and a groove at the top where they inserted different blade attachments. Reynolds had no medical background. She had never seen this kind of tool. But her description was exactly accurate. The Midas Rex bone saw does look remarkably like an electric toothbrush with interchangeable heads. She recalled hearing a female voice say that her blood vessels were too small, that they couldn't find a suitable artery in her right leg. Then she heard them talking about trying the left side instead. This conversation actually happened during her surgery. It occurred while they were trying to connect her to the heart-lung bypass machine. She described watching her body from above while hearing the song Hotel California playing in the operating room. Dr. Spetzler, her neurosurgeon, was interviewed about the case years later. He said her descriptions matched his memory. From a scientific perspective, he has no explanation for how it could have happened. The surgery itself lasted nearly 7 hours. The total time Reynolds was in cardiac arrest, with no blood in her brain and a completely flat EEG, was about an hour. When they restarted her heart and warmed her body, Pam Reynolds woke up. She recovered completely from the surgery, and she never stopped talking about what she experienced during those moments of clinical death. Reynolds described entering a tunnel of light. She said she encountered her deceased grandmother and other relatives. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace and love. She did not want to return to her body. Skeptics have proposed that Reynolds could have heard the conversations during the surgery before she was fully under anesthesia or during the process of waking up. Anesthesiologist Gerald Worley has argued that awareness during anesthesia could explain her perceptions, but supporters of the case point out that the clicking speakers in her ears were specifically designed to monitor brainstem function by ensuring no auditory signals were being processed. The tape over her eyes made seeing impossible, and much of what she described occurred during the period when her brain showed no electrical activity whatsoever. Pam Reynolds died in 2010 from heart failure at age 53, but her case remains one of the most studied, debated, and compelling near-death experiences ever recorded. And if you thought that was intense, wait until you hear about the patient who saw his surgeon doing something so bizarre that it could only be confirmed by asking the doctor himself. Number 8. The man who saw his surgeon flapping like a bird. On January 18, 1988, Al Sullivan was rushed into emergency surgery at Hartford Hospital in Connecticut. He was 56 years old, a truck driver, and his coronary artery had just become blocked during diagnostic testing, requiring an immediate quadruple bypass. Sullivan was placed under general anesthesia. The surgeons opened his chest. Standard cardiac procedure. Nothing unusual. But Al Sullivan wasn't experiencing anything standard. He described rising out of his body, finding himself in what he called an amphitheater-like place. He could see his own body lying on the table below. His chest was open. His heart was exposed. And then he noticed something strange about his surgeon. Dr. Hiroyoshi Takata, who had just explained the surgical procedure to Sullivan before the operation, appeared to be doing something very odd with his arms. Here's how Sullivan described it. He said the surgeon appeared to be somewhat perplexed. And then, in Sullivan's words, he thought the doctor was flapping his arms as if trying to fly. Sullivan told this story to his cardiologist, Dr. Anthony LaSala, after the surgery. LaSala had been dismissing Sullivan's entire near-death account as a drug-induced hallucination. The tunnel of light, the deceased relatives, the sense of peace. Standard fare for someone coming out of major cardiac surgery. But when Sullivan mentioned the flapping arms, LaSala stopped dismissing. Because Dr. Takata had a very unusual habit. After scrubbing in for surgery, Takata would hold his freshly sterilized hands against his chest to keep them from touching anything before putting on his surgical gloves. And when he needed to give instructions to his assistants, when he needed to point at various surgical instruments, he would use his elbows. Picture it. A surgeon with his hands pressed to his chest, arms bent, pointing with his elbows at different tools across the room. It would look exactly like someone flapping their arms, like someone trying to fly. Dr. LaSala later said that this quirky habit was something Takata had never seen any other surgeon do. It was completely unique to him. When researchers followed up with Takata himself, he confirmed the unusual behavior. He said he had developed this habit to maintain sterility while still being able to direct his team. But here's the critical question. When could Sullivan have possibly seen this? The arm flapping happened before Takata put on his surgical gloves, which means it happened in the early preparation phase before the major surgery began. But Sullivan was already under general anesthesia at that point. He should have been completely unconscious. His eyes were closed, he was draped and prepared for the procedure, and yet he accurately described something that only someone in the operating room, someone with a clear view of the surgical team, could have observed. Sullivan went on to describe other elements of the experience. He saw his deceased mother, his brother-in-law who had passed. There was a tunnel lit in a golden hue, a pervading sense of euphoria and peace. But it's that weird detail about the arm flapping that makes this case so intriguing to researchers, because it's not the kind of thing you would hallucinate. It's not an archetypal near-death image. It's just a bizarre, specific, verifiable detail that turned out to be absolutely accurate. Sullivan told his story at a meeting of the Connecticut chapter of the International Association for Near-Death Studies in 1990. The surgeons weren't formally interviewed until 9 years after the surgery. Some skeptics argue that this long gap allowed Sullivan to refine his account or incorporate information he learned later. But Dr. LaSala's immediate reaction to the flapping arms detail suggests that Sullivan described it long before any investigation took place, and nobody has explained how a patient under general anesthesia could have known about a surgeon's unusual hand positioning habit. But the next case might be even harder to explain, because it involves a man who was not just unconscious, but comatose for over a week, and when he woke up, he recognized a nurse he had never met while conscious. Number 7. The case of the missing dentures. In the winter of 1979, an ambulance brought a comatose 44-year-old man into the coronary care unit of a Dutch hospital. He had been found lying in a cold, damp meadow about an hour earlier. He was hypothermic, he had no pulse, he was cyanotic, meaning his skin had turned blue from lack of oxygen. In other words, he was dying. The medical team immediately began resuscitation. They applied heart massage and defibrillation. They needed to intubate him to provide artificial respiration. But when they tried to insert the breathing tube, they discovered something in his mouth. Dentures. A young nurse named T.G. removed the upper dentures and placed them onto what he called the crash cart. A small cart filled with bottles and supplies with a sliding wooden shelf that was already pulled out. He tossed the dentures onto that shelf to get them out of the way and continued with the intubation. The resuscitation continued for over an hour. 5 rounds of defibrillation, chest compressions. The patient looked dead. His pupils were unresponsive. There were no signs of consciousness whatsoever. But he was young, and the team didn't give up. Eventually, a faint heart rhythm appeared. Signs of spontaneous breathing. The patient was transferred to the intensive care unit on mechanical ventilation. He remained in a deep coma for more than a week, and then he woke up. TG was no longer working in the coronary care unit. He had been transferred to another department. One night, during his shift, he entered a room in the rehabilitation ward to distribute medications, and there, lying in a hospital bed, was the comatose man from the meadow. Only now he was conscious. And he took one look at TG and said something that made the nurse's blood run cold. The patient said, "That nurse knows where my dentures are." TG was stunned. He had never met this man while the patient was conscious. Their only encounter had been during the resuscitation when the patient was comatose and being actively given CPR. But the man continued. He described exactly what had happened. He said TG was there when he was brought into the hospital, and that TG took his dentures out of his mouth and put them onto that cart. He described the cart specifically. He said it had bottles on it. There was a sliding drawer underneath, and that's where TG put the teeth. TG was flabbergasted. He remembered this happening while the man was in deep coma and in the process of CPR. When asked how he knew this, the patient said he had seen himself lying in bed. He had perceived from above how the nurses and doctors had been busy with the resuscitation. He was able to describe correctly and in detail the small room in which he had been resuscitated. He described what the people looked like. He described where everything was positioned. He even said that during the experience, he was very much afraid that the medical team would stop CPR and that he would die. This case was reported by Dutch cardiologist Dr. Pim van Lommel in a landmark study published in the medical journal The Lancet in 2001. Van Lommel had conducted a prospective study of 344 cardiac arrest patients in the Netherlands. Of those who survived and could be interviewed, 18% reported having had a near-death experience. But the dentures case stood out because it wasn't just a patient describing a tunnel of light or meeting deceased relatives. This was specific, verifiable information about events that occurred while the patient's brain was not receiving oxygen. The patient had never been to that hospital before. He had never seen that resuscitation room. He had never met TG. And during the entire time he was supposedly watching from above, he was in cardiac arrest, being actively resuscitated. The case has been analyzed exhaustively by both believers and skeptics. Anesthesiologist Gerald Worley has argued that efficient cardiac resuscitation can sometimes restore enough brain function for brief moments of awareness. The patient might have heard or felt his dentures being removed and incorporated this into a memory. But the patient didn't just know his dentures were removed. He described the specific cart, the sliding shelf that was already pulled out, the bottles on top. He described the room layout and the appearance of the staff. He recognized TG's face a week later. When you watch someone from a position near the ceiling, you see things differently than when you're lying on a bed. The perspective matters. Van Lommel's study sparked intense debate in the medical community, but it also opened the door to larger questions. If consciousness can exist during cardiac arrest, what does that mean for our understanding of the brain? What does that mean for our understanding of death itself? And if you think the dentures case is compelling, wait until you hear about people who saw during their near-death experience who had never been able to see at all. People who were blind from birth. Number 6. The blind woman who saw for the first time while she was dying. Vicky Umipeg was born blind. Her optic nerve had been completely destroyed at birth due to excess oxygen in the incubator. She had never seen anything. Not light, not shadows, not colors, not shapes, nothing. Her entire 45 years of life had been lived in complete darkness. Until she died. In 1973, Vicky was in a serious car accident. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Her heart stopped. Medical staff worked to resuscitate her. And then something happened that should have been impossible. Vicky found herself floating above her body. She could see. For the first time in her entire existence, Vicky could see. She described looking down at the medical team working over her body. She recognized herself lying on the table. She was pretty thin at the time, quite tall. She saw her body, but she didn't recognize it at first because she had never seen herself before. She described the rings she was wearing, a plain gold band on her right ring finger, her father's wedding ring next to it. But she noticed her wedding ring the most because it was unusual. It had orange blossoms on the corners of it. This detail is extraordinary when you think about it. Vicky knew what her rings felt like. She had worn them for years, but she had never seen them. She had no visual memory of orange blossoms because she had no concept of what orange or blossoms looked like. And yet, during her near-death experience, she saw them clearly. Following her out-of-body experience, Vicky found herself rising through the ceilings of the hospital. She passed through multiple floors until she was above the roof itself. She described having a brief panoramic view of her surroundings. She felt exhilarated, free. She was enjoying the sensation of movement that she had never experienced before. Then she entered what she described as a tunnel, and beyond that, light, overwhelming, beautiful light. She encountered deceased friends and relatives, 2 close friends from her youth who had also been blind. They had died before her, and during the near-death experience, she could see them. Vicky later told researchers that this was the only time she could ever relate to seeing and to what light was, because she experienced it. Dr. Kenneth Ring, a professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut, became fascinated by reports of blind people having visual experiences during near-death events. Along with Sharon Cooper, he conducted a 2-year study interviewing 31 blind individuals who had reported near-death or out-of-body experiences. Their findings, published in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in 1997 and later expanded into a book called Mindsight, were remarkable. 80% of their blind respondents reported some form of visual perception during their experiences. This included people who were blind from birth, like Vicky, people who had never developed the neurological pathways required for vision, people who didn't dream in images because they had no visual memories to draw from. And yet, when they died or came close to death, they could see. Ring and Cooper concluded that blind persons in their study saw what they certainly could not possibly have seen physically. They developed a concept they called mindsight, a kind of transcendental awareness that goes beyond normal sensory perception. Skeptics have raised valid questions. Could blind people learn what to expect in a near-death experience from cultural sources? Could they reconstruct memories based on what they've been told about sight? Could the experiences be symbolic rather than literal? But some of the details in these cases are extremely difficult to explain away. Vicky's description of her wedding ring with specific visual details she had never encountered. Blind respondents describing the colors and shapes of medical equipment they couldn't have known about. Accurate accounts of who was present during resuscitation and what they were doing. Ring summed up his findings by saying that what the blind experience is more astonishing than the claim that they have seen. They have transcended brain-based consciousness altogether. If the brain is required for consciousness, how do blind people develop visual awareness during the precise moment when their brain is shutting down? This is one of the questions that keeps near-death researchers searching for answers. And it turns out Maria wasn't the only one who saw a shoe during a near-death experience. The pattern repeated itself in a completely different hospital, with a completely different patient. Number 5. The red shoe on the Hartford Hospital roof. In 1985, a nurse named Kathy Milne was working at Hartford Hospital in Connecticut. Milne had been interested in near-death experiences for some time, collecting accounts from patients who had survived cardiac arrest. One day, she found herself talking with a woman who had just been resuscitated. The woman had experienced something profound during her brush with death. She described how she floated up over her body and watched the resuscitation effort for a short time. Standard near-death territory so far. But then she felt herself being pulled up through several floors of the hospital. She passed through ceilings and walls as if they weren't there. And then she found herself above the roof. She realized she was looking at the skyline of Hartford. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a red object sitting on the roof ledge. It turned out to be a shoe. When Milne investigated, she found the shoe exactly where the patient had described it, a red shoe on the hospital roof. This case was documented by Dr. Kenneth Ring and Madeleine Lawrence in a paper called Further Evidence for Veridical Perception During Near-Death Experiences, published in 1993. They had been collecting cases similar to Maria's tennis shoe, cases where patients reported seeing improbable objects in unlikely locations during their near-death experiences, cases where the objects were later confirmed to exist. The Hartford shoe case is particularly interesting because it appeared to independently replicate the Seattle case. 2 different hospitals, 2 different patients, 2 different researchers, and both involving a shoe on a ledge that the patient couldn't have known about. Ring noted the odd coincidence. 2 of their most compelling cases involved shoes. He had no explanation for why footwear kept showing up on hospital rooftops, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Hartford patient had never been on that roof. She had no reason to know there was a shoe up there. And yet, during the brief window when her heart had stopped, she somehow perceived its existence. These cases matter because they provide something rare in near-death research, verifiable details. It's one thing to describe a tunnel of light or a feeling of peace. Those experiences are subjective. They can't be confirmed or denied. But a shoe on a roof, that can be checked, and when it's found exactly where the patient described it, with characteristics the patient specified, skeptics have to work much harder to explain it away. Of course, the scientific establishment wanted more rigorous proof, which leads us to one of the largest and most ambitious near-death studies ever conducted. Number 4. The AWARE studies and the hunt for scientific proof. Dr. Sam Parnia had a problem. He was a critical care physician who dealt with dying patients regularly. He had heard countless stories from cardiac arrest survivors about experiences during resuscitation, floating above their bodies, watching the medical team work, seeing things they shouldn't have been able to see. But hearing stories wasn't enough. Parnia wanted proof. In 2008, he launched a massive research project called AWARE, Awareness During Resuscitation. The study would span 15 hospitals across the United States, United Kingdom, and Austria. Over 2,060 cardiac arrest events would be recorded. But the innovative part was the methodology. Parnia's team placed shelves high up in key areas of participating hospitals. On the upper side of each shelf, facing the ceiling, they placed specific images, pictures that could only be seen from above, from the perspective of someone floating near the ceiling. The logic was elegant. If patients were really leaving their bodies during cardiac arrest, if they were really floating above the scene and watching their own resuscitation, then some of them should be able to see and report the hidden images. The study ran for years. Of the 2,060 cardiac arrests recorded, 330 patients survived. Of those, 140 were well enough to be interviewed. And of those interviewed, 46% reported memories of some kind during their cardiac arrest. 9% reported experiences that qualified as near-death experiences by standard criteria. 2% described awareness with explicit recall of seeing and hearing events related to their resuscitation. But here's where it gets complicated. One patient in particular stood out. A 57-year-old man who described in detail what happened during his resuscitation. He accurately recalled events that occurred while his brain should have been non-functional. The medical team was able to verify his account. The problem? The room he was in wasn't equipped with the hidden image shelves. 78% of the cardiac arrests in the study happened in rooms that didn't have the target images installed. So while Parnia found compelling evidence that some patients retained awareness during cardiac arrest, he didn't get the definitive visual proof he was hoping for. No patient saw and correctly identified the hidden images. Parnia launched a second study, AWARE 2, which ran from 2017 to 2020, with more sophisticated monitoring equipment. This time, researchers rushed into resuscitation rooms with portable EEG sensors and tablets displaying hidden images facing the ceiling. Out of 28 interviews with survivors, 6 patients reported near-death experiences. None of them explicitly recalled the hidden images or auditory stimuli that had been presented during their resuscitation. But the EEG data revealed something intriguing. Some patients showed brain activity that researchers deemed compatible with consciousness during periods when such activity shouldn't have been possible. Parnia has said that the results suggest consciousness may be present during cardiac arrest even when clinically undetectable. This, together with fearful experiences, may contribute to PTSD and other cognitive deficits in cardiac arrest survivors. The AWARE studies haven't proven that consciousness survives death, but they have demonstrated that something more complex is happening during cardiac arrest than our current models of the brain can explain. And while scientists debate the implications, children have been having near-death experiences of their own. Children too young to have been influenced by cultural expectations about what death should feel like. Number 3. The little girl who drowned and came back with memories. Dr. Melvin Morse was a pediatrician in Seattle when he first encountered a case that would change the direction of his career. A young girl named Katie had been found floating face down in a swimming pool. She had been underwater for 19 minutes. By the time paramedics arrived, she was clinically dead. No pulse, no breathing, massive swelling of the brain, fixed and dilated pupils. Her chances of survival were estimated at about 10%. Her chances of surviving without severe brain damage were even lower. The medical team worked on Katie for hours. They put her on an artificial lung. They did everything possible to save her. And 3 days later, against all odds, she woke up. Katie made a complete recovery. No brain damage, no cognitive impairment, a medical miracle by any standard. But when Dr. Morse examined her in follow-up, Katie told him something extraordinary. She described the emergency room and the resuscitation effort in accurate detail. She correctly described Dr. Morse himself, even though she had been profoundly comatose during the entire experience with her eyes closed. She identified another physician who had been present. She recalled numerous other details of the emergency room. But Katie's memories extended beyond the hospital. She described the paramedics working on her at the pool. She remembered being transported in the ambulance. She recalled details that had happened while she was unconscious and, by all medical measures, dead. Perhaps most remarkably, she described meeting a woman during her near-death experience. A woman made of light who had told her it wasn't her time yet. Dr. Morse was a skeptical scientist. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but Katie's case haunted him. How could a comatose child accurately describe her own resuscitation? How could she know details from before she even arrived at the hospital? He began collecting similar cases. He eventually studied hundreds of children who had survived near-death events. His findings were published in the American Journal of Diseases of Children and later in books like Closer to the Light. Morse found that 85% of children who survived cardiac arrest reported near-death experiences. This was remarkably higher than the roughly 10 to 18% found in adult studies. Children's accounts were particularly compelling to researchers because children haven't been exposed to the same cultural narratives about death. They haven't read books about tunnels of light. They haven't seen movies about near-death experiences. They described what they perceived without the filter of adult expectations. Katie's case remains one of the most well-documented pediatric near-death experiences. A child who was dead for an extended period, who made an impossible recovery, and who came back with memories of events she shouldn't have been able to perceive. But the most famous cardiac surgeon in the world also had experiences to share. A pioneer of heart surgery who watched patients die and return with stories that challenged everything he believed. Number 2. The cardiac surgeon who changed his mind about death. Dr. Lloyd Rudy was a legend in cardiac surgery. He was one of the pioneers of the field, training under some of the earliest heart surgeons and going on to teach and mentor generations of physicians. Throughout his career, Rudy operated on thousands of patients. Many of them experienced clinical death on his operating table. Their hearts stopped, they flatlined, and then, if everything went well, they were brought back. Rudy was a scientist. He believed in what he could see and measure. The idea that consciousness could exist outside the brain seemed absurd to him, until 2 cases changed his thinking entirely. The first involved a patient who had died during heart surgery. The medical team had been working on him for an extended period with no success. they decided to stop resuscitation. There was nothing more they could do. But then, inexplicably, the patient's heart started beating again on its own. He survived. When the man woke up, he told Rudy something that made the surgeon's blood run cold. He described floating above the operating room and watching the entire surgery. He accurately described specific instruments that had been used. He recalled conversations between the medical staff. And then he mentioned something he couldn't possibly have known. There had been sticky notes on the monitor in the operating room, notes with specific information written on them. The patient described the notes and what they said. Rudy was shaken. The patient had been dead. His eyes had been covered. His brain had been without oxygen. And yet he knew about sticky notes that could only have been seen from a position above the operating table. The second case was even more dramatic. Another patient who had died during surgery, another heart that had stopped for an extended period, and another recovery that seemed impossible. This patient also described watching the surgery from above. He knew details about the procedure that a layperson couldn't have known. He described the positions of the surgical team. He recalled specific moments during the resuscitation effort. Dr. Rudy went public with these stories in a video interview before his death in 2012. He acknowledged that as a scientist, he couldn't explain what had happened. But as someone who had witnessed these events firsthand, he could no longer dismiss the possibility that consciousness might exist independently of the brain. The cases Rudy described haven't been formally documented in the same way as some others in this video. They rely on his testimony, but his reputation in the medical community lent significant weight to his accounts. Here was a surgeon who had seen everything, who had watched countless patients die, who had every reason to maintain a purely materialist view of consciousness. And yet, at the end of his career, he was saying that something happens after death that science cannot explain. And that brings us to our final case, the one that ties everything together and asks the question that still haunts researchers today. Number 1. The big question that science still can't answer. In 2014, the medical journal Resuscitation published a study that attempted to answer once and for all whether near-death experiences represent genuine perception or mere hallucination. The AWARE study had interviewed cardiac arrest survivors across multiple countries. The researchers had heard stories about tunnels and light and deceased relatives. But one case stood out from all the others. A patient accurately described events that occurred during a 3-minute period of cardiac arrest. He recalled conversations that happened. He described actions taken by the medical team. He provided details that were later verified by the staff present. But here's what made this case different. The researchers had been monitoring his brain activity throughout the resuscitation. During the time he claimed to be conscious, his brain showed no detectable electrical activity. According to our current understanding of neuroscience, consciousness requires brain function. You need active neurons, processing information, creating the experience of awareness. When the brain shuts down, consciousness should cease. And yet this patient had accurate memories of events that occurred while his brain was not functioning. Sam Parnia has said this together with the broader findings of the AWARE studies suggests that consciousness may be present during cardiac arrest even when clinically undetectable. He has proposed that perhaps consciousness doesn't stop immediately when the heart stops. Perhaps there's a period of continued awareness that our current monitoring technologies simply can't detect. But others have gone further. Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel, who conducted the Lancet study with the dentures case, has argued that near-death experiences suggest consciousness may not be produced by the brain at all, that the brain may function more like a receiver or filter, accessing a consciousness that exists independently. This is a radical idea. It goes against everything modern neuroscience believes about the relationship between brain and mind. But consider the evidence we've reviewed. Maria saw a shoe on a ledge she couldn't have accessed. Pam Reynolds accurately described her surgery while her brain was completely flatlined. Al Sullivan knew about his surgeon's unusual arm movements. The Dutch patient recognized a nurse he'd never consciously met. Blind people saw for the first time while they were dying. Children with no cultural exposure to near-death narratives described the same experiences as adults. Each case individually might be explained away. Coincidence, fabrication, misremembered details, anesthesia awareness. But taken together, they form a pattern that's very difficult to dismiss. Something happens when we die, something that current science cannot fully explain. Maybe consciousness is more than the firing of neurons. Maybe the mind can perceive the world even when the brain has stopped functioning. Maybe death is not the end of awareness, but a transition to a different kind of existence. Or maybe there's a purely physical explanation that we simply haven't discovered yet. Maybe our understanding of the brain is incomplete in ways we don't even realize. Either way, these cases represent one of the greatest mysteries in science. They force us to confront questions we've been asking since humans first became aware of their own mortality. What happens when we die? Where does consciousness go? Is there something beyond the final heartbeat? For Maria and her tennis shoe. For Pam Reynolds, watching her own brain surgery. For the blind woman who saw light for the first time. For the man who knew where his dentures were placed. Something happened. Something real. And until science can explain it, the mystery remains. What do you think? Are these cases evidence that consciousness survives death? Or is there a simpler explanation we're missing? We're genuinely curious to hear your thoughts, so share your opinions in the comments below. If you found this video fascinating, make sure you subscribe. We cover the mysteries that science still can't explain. And if you want to explore more documented cases that challenge our understanding of reality, that video is on screen now.